Morning, guys. So I'm just going to go over a brief little kind of summary slash analysis for chapters 3 and 4. Especially when you guys are doing these reading assignments, I know that getting into the book can be weird because you're kind of being immersed in this whole new society, this utopia with little air quotes around it. And so I want to make sure we're understanding everything. So if you end up watching this before you listen to it, that's great. Just make sure that you are listening or reading the chapters as well as also kind of checking in on these little lectures. So today we're going to have the assignment of chapters 3 and 4. Really, what was established in the first two chapters of this book was kind of the groundwork for how people are made in this society, and hopefully you put together the connection that people are manufactured a lot like Henry Ford's assembly line whole philosophy for how he created cars. And so that's one of the reasons that if you caught on to Ford's name is mentioned in this book, and we're going to see that he's kind of central to the society. I think at one point in chapter 2, they make a note that the director does the sign of the T, right? In other words, the Model T on his chest, and says, like, our Ford instead of our Lord. So Ford, or consumerism, which is kind of what he stands for, is now at the center of this society. The other thing that we kind of got to look at in chapters 1 and 2 was the motto that this world state has, which is community, identity, and stability. So the whole process by which people are, number one, made in a factory, and then number two, conditioned in the bottles, and then also once they're born, quote unquote, that's part of social stability. So making sure that everyone is happy with whatever hand that they're dealt, that's a result of this conditioning, which creates the social stability. So, in these chapters, we're going to find out a little bit more about community as far as how community is viewed in this society. So, in chapter 3, if you're reading in the book, this starts on page 30. We remember the readers are still like these students that are on this tour, and now we're led outside into the hatchery's garden. So, first in chapter 2, we saw the babies and how they're conditioned to hate books and flowers. Sorry, my dog is drinking water and he's very loud. Boomer. Hopefully you can hear me over his drinking. Anyway, but they're led outside to where now there are older children playing, not older as in like 10 or 12, but 3, 4, 5 year olds running around. And one thing to note is that they are naked. All right. The director, as he's talking to the students, kind of witnesses this interaction between a little girl and a boy, where this little girl takes this little boy into the bushes and he runs out crying, and the little girl is nervous because she doesn't want to get in trouble. She thinks she did something wrong. So based on this interaction and the nurse that comes over to attend to these two children, we learn that in this society, the children are encouraged to play with one another. And the certain play that the book calls it is erotic play. So something that would be totally disgusting and kind of absurd in our own society, seeing little kids do this, is something that is accepted. Now, this is not just for shock value, this is more part of their conditioning them to be okay with interacting with multiple different people or partners, and engaging in this physical act at a young age is considered a way that they belong to one another. So they'll go on and explain further in this chapter that there's no such thing as family, there's no such thing as marriage, there's no such thing as commitment. Everybody belongs to everybody else. And this is one of the early ways that they really start to encourage that. All right. Then they come across this guy sitting on a bench, and it just so happens that this is one of the most important people literally in the world. This is Mustafa Mond, and he is the world controller for Central Europe. So he's like the president of one of these 10 world states. And he basically gives these students a history lesson. Now, it's not because the students wouldn't have already known this, but again, we as readers are sitting in the seat of being the students. So we are finding out, if you, especially after this whole thing with why are these little kids playing with each other, is shocking to you, Mustafa Mond gives us kind of a reasoning of how we ended up here. In other words, how the society ended up where they are. So he talks about, and I've got page numbers listed on here. So if you have the book, you can, specifically see these passages. says that people used to live in families, right? And he refers to this is on page 36. People established homes with one another. That's on page 37. And what he found was, or what people found was that living in homes with families, it ended up breeding really negative emotions. People would go crazy. People were sad. People were unhappy. It's kind of ironic reading about this now when we've all been, stuck in quarantine for over a month and you've been at home with your families in homes. Um, so he basically said this was not a way to create a perfect world, a utopia, living in homes and families. So they decided that that needed to be one of the elements of society that they got rid of, people living together and having relationships. We would all be much happier if we didn't feel these meaningful connections to others. He goes on page 49 and 50 to talk about, you couldn't just use force. You can't hold a gun to a person's head and say you will no longer be in a family. But basically, the world had to get bad enough where there were terror attacks and there were bombings and there were wars that eventually people asked the government to help them rather than the government using force to tell the people what to do. So within these pages is kind of, again, how we ended up in this current society. The current world that they are in is a result of the changes that the government's made. All right. In this chapter, one of the interesting things is if you've ever seen a film, someone gave me the example. I think this was Dylan at one point, where you cut away and you have in Avengers: Infinity War at the end when they have the battlefield and they keep cutting to different parts of the battlefield, and you can follow each individual storyline because you're seeing it, even though there's a dialogue on one part of the battlefield and then another and then from inside. So the rest of chapter 3 is kind of like that. On the one hand, we've got these quick cuts where it's Mustafa Mond giving a history lesson and talking to the tour group. One of the other places that gets cut away to, and usually it's nice because they have, if you're in the book, there's like a gap or a space between where these different scenes, if you will, take place. The other scene that we're seeing is one of Lenina, who is the nurse that we saw had some kind of romantic connection with Henry Foster. And she is talking to another beta nurse named Fanny in the locker room of their shift after work. So this would just be like, at a hospital nowadays, before you go home, you don't just go home in your scrubs that you've been wearing all day at work. You go to the locker room, you change into something else, and then you go home. So they're in this locker room, and Fanny brings up this conversation with Lenina about how people are starting to judge her because she has been seeing only Henry Foster for 4 months. All right. They use terminology like you're letting him have you. That means, physically, not they're in a relationship, boyfriend, girlfriend, but she's only been sleeping with one guy for 4 months, which is, cause for gossip. It's scandalous. So Lenina starts to defend her actions, which is interesting because those of you that are going to choose Lenina for your Hero's Journey project, which you'll see later on today, for how she starts off before her call to adventure, most people, as we've seen, their conditioning, everyone has this kind of shared mindset, but she is disagreeing with Fanny. She says, well, you know what? I haven't been feeling very keen on promiscuity lately. So for someone that's been conditioned since before she was even born, it's interesting that she has this kind of alternative opinion about how she should be acting. But she eventually kind of gives in and says, okay, well, if I should be more promiscuous, Bernard Marx, who's one of our main characters, she remembers that he asked her to go on vacation with him to a savage reservation. Now, this invitation to vacation is very much a invitation to sleep with him. So, a couple things here. There are a lot of rumors that swirl around about Bernard. He's an alpha male, meaning he is of that highest caste. But there are also rumors because he's not as physically built as the other alpha males. So he's intellectually very smart, similarly, to the other alphas, but he's short. And so there's this rumor that somebody slipped some alcohol into his, they call it a blood surrogate, but it would be like that womb bottle that it travels on the assembly line. So her agreeing to go out with him is also a little bit unconventional because he's not, a normal alpha that most people would consider going out with. A savage reservation will be explained a lot more later, but essentially, savages are people that do not live in the type of society ascribed to here. So, not the people that are conditioned, people that basically live like barbarians, filthy, dirty, And so it would be kind of like going to see people in a zoo almost. Fanny criticizes Lenina because Bernard is seen as odd for his class, and then they end up talking about Lenina's Malthusian belt. This is another one of those totally made up terms from Aldous Huxley, and essentially, women that are, remember, not made sterile, so 30% of the females that are made still have ovaries and reproductive capabilities. So they don't want people to have babies the viviparous way, the old fashioned way. So they wear these belts as kind of like a fashion statement, almost as like how now people carry around water bottles with them or have their Crocs or whatever it is you people are wearing these days. But as one of their fashion statements is this Malthusian belt that basically holds her birth control pills. So again, something kind of shocking to society that we would keep, very private and personal. You don't go flashing it around. Here's my birth control case. They just wear it as part of an accessory to their outfit. All right, the third little scene that they kind of keep cutting to, so we've got Mustafa Mond and the tour, we've got Lenina and Fanny, is now, on the other hand, we've got the men's locker room after the shift change, and in this locker room, Bernard, who Lenina was thinking of going out with, accepting his invitation, he's overhearing a conversation that Henry Foster, Lenina's current person she's sleeping with, is having with another man. So this would be, you imagine typical locker room talk. Henry Foster's talking about having Lenina, in other words, having sex with Lenina. In this society, this would be totally accepted, but Bernard is reacting more like someone in our society would if you heard somebody, kind of degradingly talking about having this woman. They continuously use this term pneumatic when describing her, and this makes Bernard really angry. Pneumatic essentially is bouncy. So as he's discussing Henry having Lenina or having sex with her, he says, "Oh, she's just so pleasantly bouncy. You really should have her." He's telling this to his other friend. So we can see that the accepted thing with romance and relationships is there is none. Everybody belongs to everybody else, and everyone is encouraged to interact with in a sexual way each other. And again, what's notable here, if you're going to choose Bernard for your hero's journey, how Bernard starts out before the call to adventure is he is notably different because he gets angry. He seems to actually like or have feelings for Lenina because he gets upset with how they're describing her as a piece of meat. So after Henry advises his companion to try Lenina out, Bernard remembers that he actually did ask Lenina out, and he realizes she was supposed to give him her answer this week. His feelings that he has at the moment as he's overhearing their conversation is he starts to have feelings of hatred. He even considers fighting them, but because of that whole rumor that somebody slipped alcohol into his blood surrogate, he's much smaller than they are. They notice his anger as they leave the locker room, and they basically tell him, like, "Hey, dude, take a soma." Now, soma is another reason that this book is kind of continuously challenged or banned. So far we've got promiscuity that often gets it banned. For when the time it was written, this whole idea of kids being made in factories would have been very controversial. But soma is another one. Soma is essentially a drug, and in this society, this drug is used to add stability to people's overall mood or happiness. So it's basically a drug that you take, and it just takes you to a different place, and you're allowed to be just as happy as you can be. So, because this society is set up so that people can be happy, it is a utopia. It's interesting that Bernard stands out and that he is so unhappy. All right, so how is this place different from our world? Take your pick. There's a ton. Character introductions that we had here. Bernard Marx is an alpha male that's physically smaller than the others. The result is, I like to say, he has an inferiority complex, and it makes him feel like an outsider. So again, how he's different in their state motto of community, identity, stability, he feels like he is not one of the community because he is an outsider. Mustafa Mond, again, is a world controller for Central Europe. He's going to be more of a minor character, but somebody that's there in the background, this all-controlling force, if you will. All right, some significant quotes. I picked out some of these little phrases that they use during hypnopedia or the sleep teaching. Everybody belongs to everybody else. ending is better than mending. So the first one deals with romantic relationships. Ending is better than mending. That's referring to like literal products and clothes. And it's because this is a consumer driven society. The more stitches, the less riches. So a little bit of the communist approach coming in here. The more you buy, the more clothes you have, the less money you have. But that's okay because then nobody really can be more wealthy than somebody else. And then the last one, history is both. All right. Things that stood out to me, if you remember back to Fahrenheit 451, I said that Mustafa Mond kind of reminds me of Beatty. Not everybody knows the history of how things came to be the way that they are. And Mustafa Mond, just like Beatty, seems to know a lot more than everybody else. Something else that stood out, everything is flip flopped from what you expect in your own society. The acceptable locker room talk, or the children and their erotic play. There are quick scene cuts that keep the action moving forward, but also a little bit confusing. What's the point of that? It's kind of disorienting. Bernard and Lenina both have different behavior than some of the other people. They like solitude and they do not prefer promiscuity. This last one is one of my favorite sayings from this entire book, and it's just something for you to think about right now. But the children, the way that they're conditioned, their mind is not individual. So the third word in our world state motto, community identity stability, we haven't talked about identity. This is another ironic word because nobody really has an identity. All right, I say that, kind of disregarding Bernard and Lenina, but because everyone's mind is just a sum of what the state tells them, there is no individualism. Everybody is just like everybody else. All right, so I don't have another beautiful presentation for the next chapter, just because usually I have students that start presenting when we get to chapter 4. So for this one, I'm just going to have my notes on the screen and you can kind of listen. Chapter 4 kind of picks up with the storyline now, more so of plot. So we're not going to return to the tour anymore where we're finding out any more about how the society is. Now we really jump into what the plot is. So at this point, we have the end of the shift change, and these two storylines kind of converge. All of the alphas and betas are heading to the roof. They have helicopters that kind of take them around. We see that Lenina is adored by many men because many men have had her. So she would be kind of the ideal woman in the society. She typically, it seems like anyway in the past, followed what people had as far as expectations for her. She notices Bernard, who, it has this scowl on his face because he just overheard people talking about him. And she decides to make a very public display of his accepting his invitation because she wants to make sure that people know she's not faithful to Henry Foster. So, again, something that is kind of the opposite of what we would expect. If you're seeing one person and you accept an invitation to sleep with another, especially in public, that would give you, a label, many choice words. But here, it's just showing that she is a good member of society. Bernard gets super embarrassed. They're in a public elevator, and he actually suggests that they talk about it somewhere else because he's uncomfortable. Um, they step out onto the roof, and something else that marks Bernard is different. Remember, these people have been conditioned not to enjoy flowers and nature, and Bernard notices the scenery. He says, "Isn't it absolutely beautiful?" And all that Lenina remarks is, this is perfect weather for obstacle golf. So, if you didn't pick up on it earlier when they're talking about, this consumer driven society, not only are they consuming products, but they're also consuming activities. So, another way to keep people happy in this society is just to keep them busy doing things. So, as soon as they get done with work, they're not going home. They're going out to play some obstacle golf or to go to a wrestling match or to go to dinner, have drinks, go dancing. So, they're constantly entertained or kept busy. Bernard is approached by another guy, Benito Hoover, who has had Lenina, and he basically makes a comment how pretty Lenina is, and Bernard leaves upset. Um, Lenina, after accepting Bernard's invitation, goes off to spend the night with Henry. They go play some obstacle golf. All of these games, again, are completely made up by Aldous Huxley, but they're giving us kind of this sci fi futuristic part. Um, Bernard thinks back to Lenina accepting his proposal, but he feels negative. A quote that goes along with this on page 64: I feel wretched in a word because she behaved as any healthy and virtuous English girl ought to behave, and not in some other abnormal, extraordinary way. So, those of you working on your hero's journey with Bernard, part of his call to adventure, you might start to notice is that he's searching for something different. He doesn't seem to like this very homogenous society that he is a part of. On his way to his own helicopter, just when we start to feel a little bit bad for Bernard, maybe start to like him as a character, we see his inferiority complex when he yells at one of the little gammas that's bringing his helicopter out, and he kind of accosts him. So because he feels like he looks more like this gamma than an alpha, he treats this person very poorly. All right. Um, Bernard then, because he does not have a woman that he's going out with, he decides to head to the propaganda house. So we get another one of our semi-main characters. He's going to meet his friend Helmholtz Watson. Now, if any of these names seem odd to you, Bernard Marx, you might think like, oh, it's Karl Marx, or Helmholtz Watson. Helmholtz is another German name. Benito Hoover, Benito Mussolini. Remember that this is a satire. So some of these names that are being picked out, if you were to Google them and kind of where they came from, there is some social criticism behind these names, but that's kind of an extra added bonus layer if you get curious. Helmholtz, just like Bernard is different, Helmholtz is also different. And when the narrator kind of introduces him, he's described as a little bit too able. The book says a mental excess had produced in Helmholtz effects very similar to those which in Bernard were the result of physical defect. It was only quite recently that, grown aware of his mental excess, Helmholtz Watson had also become aware of his difference from the people who surrounded him. So Bernard feels different because he's physically different than everybody else, whereas Helmholtz feels different because he is more aware and intelligent than everybody else. So these two kind of form this interesting little pair. They might seem very similar, but later on they might be character foils or contrasts to one another. Bernard, once he sits in front of Helmholtz and they get to talking, we have some interesting thoughts that he has. On the one hand, he annoys Helmholtz because he brags about going out with Lenina when we know that's not truly how he feels. He cares about her more. But then he has these moments of these philosophical insights. So one of the ones that I like that gives us a better characterization of Bernard is on page 69 and 70. And he says, do you ever feel as though you had something inside you that was only waiting for you to give it a chance to come out? Some sort of extra power you aren't using, like water that goes out in the falls instead of through the turbines. I'm thinking of a feeling I get sometimes, a feeling that I've got something important to say and the power to say it, only I don't know what it is and I can't make any use of the power. So both of these people are not satisfied with the current world that they live in. So some questions you might have, or that I would like you to think about is, what does it seem like Bernard is searching for? Okay. Does it seem like anyone in this society is actually happy? With Fahrenheit 451, we talked about the difference between entertainment and happiness, and this would be another one where we question, are these people actually happy, or are they just very entertained and busy? And I will say that we are going to get some interesting things coming up in the next set of chapters. So have fun with chapters 3 and 4. I'll post the audiobooks along with this. Okay?